Okay, well, it's 9 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started with this morning's session. We are in B02. The session is, I've been to the Mountaintop, the future of discourse in a fractured society. So hopefully you're all where you intended to be. The way we will run today's session is I will introduce all three of our speakers. They will each then have 20 minutes, and we'll have 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. We'll proceed in the order of speaking and the order listed in the program. And that's the order in which I'll introduce. Our first presenter is Isaac Kimmel from the University of Notre Dame. Isaac is a doctoral student in sociology. His dissertation is titled COVID-19, a Partisan Boundary Setting in Conditions of Uncertainty, which explores the 2020 U.S. congressional and gubernatorial candidates' invocations of partisan values and identities and local and national interests as they communicate and justify their decisions on Twitter and thus construct the emerging pandemic as a political issue. Isaac's ancillary projects include, among others, an examination of the differences between collective memory and the construction of intellectual traditions within sociology, with an eye toward improving sociology's engagement in the public sphere, as well as an exploration of the debate over the New York Times 1619 Project and what it reveals about the role of collective memory in boundary work in contemporary U.S. political field. Each of these projects reflects Isaac's overarching research agenda, which is understanding the dialectic between formally codified knowledge and widely held cultural schemas, mediated by identities, communication infrastructures, and power dynamics. Isaac holds an MA in sociology from the University of Notre Dame and a BA in philosophy from the Catholic University of America. He anticipates finishing his degree in 2022. Our second presenter is Lucia Luzondo from the Person and Identity Project. Lucia is an eternity.
Hopefully I'll make it through eternity.
Hopefully we'll all be there, one way or the other. Lucia is an attorney, a practical theologian, television and radio host, and co-founder of Family Renewal Ministries, a ministry dedicated to promoting and defending marriage, family, and the human person in God's plan. She is also an adjunct professor of intercultural competencies and ministry at the University of Dallas. Along with her husband, Ricardo Luzondo, Lucia co-hosts a weekly television series, Created to Love, aired on EWTN Global Catholic Television, and a weekly live radio program, In the Day Today with Ricardo and Lucia, broadcast on EWTN Radio, and both aired on Spanish radio worldwide. Our third presenter is Noelle Mehring. Noelle is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where she co-directs the EPPC's Theology of Home project. She is an editor for the online women's magazine, Theology of Home, as well as co-author of the books Theology of Home and Theology of Home 2. Her writing on culture, politics, and religion has been featured in a wide range of national media outlets, including EWTN, Fox News Radio, National Review, The Federalist, The American Mind, Catholic World Report, and National Catholic Register. Her most recent book is Awake, Not Woke, a Christian response to the cult of progressive ideology. Noelle is a wife and mother of 6 who lives in Southern California. We'll begin with Isaac.
Thank you, Jessica, for that introduction, and thank you to my co-panelists as well. So, my presentation today is entitled Confronting Systemic Racism in a Post-Truth World. It's based on an article that I co-authored with my good friend Abigail Badeau, who is a doctoral student in the Old Testament program at Baylor University. She regrets that she can't be here today, but our article was published this past January in Church Life Journal. So before I start, I'd like to thank Abigail, as well as Arthur Rossman, the editor at Church Life Journal, my mother, Terry Kimmel, who helped us prepare our article for publication. Oh, great, thank you. I don't need to start over, do I?
Nope.
No. Okay. As well as the members of my Bible study, some of whom are here, who graciously served as my rehearsal audience for this presentation earlier this week. So, This talk, again, the title is Confronting Systemic Racism in a Post-Truth World. This talk will not primarily work to assert the reality of systemic racism, but will instead take it as a given. I'm resting on the ample empirical evidence in the sociological literature for systemic racism, which is simply overwhelming. A good rundown for that, if you're interested, can be found in the online journal Public Discourse. There's an article by my good friend Brandon Vaidyanathan, who's the chair of the sociology department at CUA, who goes through the evidence for it in the criminal justice system. Other examples can be found in, well, Dr. Rivers brought up some really good ones on Thursday night, so, and I can explore a little bit more of that in the Q&A. But additionally, I should note that I'm concentrating on the US case exclusively. Systemic racism is a global phenomenon, but I'm for the sake of parsimony and keeping this talk short, I'm bounding it. So, for clarity's sake, to start, I'll define racism as follows, quoting a 2017 book from the philosopher Charles Mills, and I will be returning to this definition later. Quote, I would distinguish racism in the ideational sense, a complex of ideas, beliefs, values, and racism in the socio-institutional sense, institutions, practices, social systems. For the first sense, I would favor this definition. Racism is the belief that 1, humanity can be divided into discrete races, and 2, these races are hierarchically arranged, with some races superior to others. The second sense would then refer to institutions, practices, and social systems that illicitly privilege some races at the expense of others, where racial membership, directly or indirectly, explains this privileging. Again, this presentation is intended not to demonstrate the existence of systemic racism, but to highlight the compatibility between Catholic doctrine and ideas from contemporary sociology and philosophy in order to facilitate discussions of systemic racism that resonate with Catholics who haven't experienced it directly. In so doing, I'm answering the call of the Second Vatican Council, specifically Gaudium et Spes, section 62, to learn from, quote, the secular sciences, especially psychology and sociology, so that the faithful may be brought to a more adequate and mature life of faith. So here's my thesis paragraph. God created humanity for communion with him and one another in this life. So our experience of the world is radically shaped by the ideas and attitudes we receive from the people around us. He created us ultimately for perfect communion with him and one another in the next life. So we all have the capacity to come to a fuller understanding of the one truth that is Christ. Making sense of the post-truth world as individual Catholics, and acting as the mystical body of Christ to help the world make sense of itself, requires remembering that the many and various worldviews that make up the current cultural landscape each have unique insights on God's love and his creation. Recognizing the differences in those worldviews, while emphasizing their common object, will bring about a fuller understanding of the truth and pave the way toward justice and peace. So the key concept that I'll be leaning on pretty heavily is the cultural viewpoint. I argue that human knowledge is culturally mediated and that Catholic teaching accounts for this. Humans are profoundly shaped by their social surroundings, and especially by their upbringing. Cultural models developed within a group over time form not just the opinions and preferences of each new generation, but the questions that those preferences answer, and even the objects that they perceive and judge. For most people, day-to-day life is quite repetitive. They encounter the same kinds of people and things every day and have to make the same kinds of decisions about them. Repeatedly referring to the same objects, ideas, and values is habit forming, to the point where these habits create patterns in the brain. We first learn these patterns from our families as children, and throughout life, we adapt to the patterns of the people around us. Eventually, these patterns become sophisticated enough to form cultural worldviews, including not just tastes and preferences, but beliefs and moral values. Stepping outside of the patterns of thought and behavior that one learns from one's family and peers, and exercising creativity, is possible, of course, but it's the exception, not the norm. This process is usually prompted by an encounter with someone, either in person or through a text or otherwise, who holds different principles and/or expresses them in different terms from our own. Stepping outside of our inherited sets of concepts and tastes is particularly difficult for discussions of really abstract, morally weighted issues, like systemic racism. The structure of moral thought itself makes it difficult for internal innovations or new ideas from another culture even to be understood, let alone accepted. Inherited sets of moral values do not just distinguish what is right and wrong, they have unique conceptions of what it is to be right, and even draw the boundaries of which questions are morally significant versus morally neutral. Just a moment. Now to circle back to theology. The observation that people interact with the world from a particular viewpoint also implies that our understanding of God similarly occurs through our cultural lens. This principle underlies the idea of enculturation, where religious ideas are expressed using local cultural symbols because we see God through our cultural systems. In section 14 of his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, Pope John Paul II affirms this principle. He writes that man, in his whole context, his family, social, and national circles, quote, is the primary route that the church must travel in fulfilling her mission. He is the primary and fundamental way for the church, the way traced out by Christ himself, the way that leads invariably through the mystery of the Incarnation and the redemption. End quote. The church is the church primarily through human beings in cultural contexts. The church fulfills her mission in living out the reality of Christ, who shows us God's truth, but through the human person in his relationships. The scandal of the Incarnation is that God was born in a particular time and place, and the Gospels demonstrate that Jesus brought people to him through a first-century Jewish worldview. We do the same, encountering God precisely through, not in spite of, our culturally contingent worldviews. The scandal of the Incarnation is so scandalous in part because God, who creates all things and knows each of them in their intimate detail, became a mortal, finite man who used the history and beliefs of one oppressed and dominated people, the children of Israel, to bring light to the whole world. Even more scandalously, Christ built on the nation of Israel to invite all nations to love him in their own culturally conditioned way. As individuals and as the church, we only see God, the source of truth, through our culturally specific viewpoints, as human beings in and defined by social contexts. This is reflected, for instance, in the splendid variety of the church's saints and the many local guises in which Our Lady has appeared to us. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating relativism here. All of the peoples evangelized by the church throughout salvation history are worshiping Jesus of Nazareth. Christ is not the ways, the truths, and the lives. He is singular. The world he made for us is singular. All people, even those who have never heard the name of Jesus, are made to come to know the one truth. Now, the culturally situated constraints on our knowledge are not absolute limits. In fact, they can be a strength, according to the feminist philosopher Sandra Harding. Harding, writing in this case specifically about scientists, advocates for what she terms, quote, strong objectivity, end quote, which leverages a diversity of cultural perspectives in any knowledge-producing project in order to make the knowledge producers aware of the limits of the preconceptions that they bring into the project, and provides them the opportunity to encounter approaches to their question that might be more accurate or authentic to the people who are being studied, or who would be affected by the project's outcome. So in other words, if the researchers all come from the same cultural background, they'll all have the same set of concepts, the same set of preconceptions, and so they will all have a similar approach to the project at hand. And of course that accommodates for creativity, and I'll clarify on that a little bit more in a minute. But when you have a diversity of voices, you have a diversity of concepts and a diversity of questions to ask, and a lot of really subtle distinctions that are much more difficult to devise when you have a more homogeneous team. And so any project of knowledge generation really benefits from a wide variety of cultural viewpoints that are present at the table, if you will. A prerequisite for strong objectivity is the recognition of the feature of our cultural viewpoints that Harding and other feminist theorists refer to as a standpoint. In the words of eminent black feminist sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, quote, standpoint theory argues that groups who share common placement in hierarchical power relations also share common experiences in such power relations. Such shared angles of vision lead those in similar social locations to be predisposed to interpret those experiences in a comparable fashion. The existence of the group as the unit of analysis neither means that all individuals within the group have the same experiences, nor that they interpret them in the same way. Using the group as the focal point provides space for individual agency." End quote. So by recognizing the commonality that members of social categories share as a result of that categorization, knowledge producers can recognize the common features of their own perspectives and work to overcome their limits. Now, the nature of these commonalities, the cohesiveness of the groups to whom they apply, and who defines each of those in any given case, is a matter of much discussion that's beyond the scope of this talk. Suffice it to say for now that society categorizes, for instance, women or African Americans as a collectivity and treats them a certain way, and members of those groups respond to that categorization more or less collectively, such that it forms a potential element of their standpoint. Crucially, and controversially, some standpoints have an advantage over others in the scope of their contribution to the production of knowledge. The basis for this assertion goes back at least as far as the great African-American intellectual and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, who was born during the era of Reconstruction in 1868 and died as the civil rights movement reached its fever pitch in 1963. In his seminal collection of essays, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois describes the quote-unquote double consciousness that he was forced to develop in his youth. Du Bois had to navigate the norms, values, and expectations that applied to his white peers, while also developing a second set of cultural standards in order to navigate his status as a second-class citizen in profoundly divided 19th century America. Contemporary feminist scholars broaden this concept to include the standpoints of women, other ethnic and religious minorities, and all historically oppressed groups, who grow up and move through life at a distance from the cultural viewpoints of dominant groups, whose members can more often afford to take them for granted without being challenged. You might be starting to wonder how all this relates to Catholic morality and to systemic racism. So before we get back into that, let's reiterate Mills's definition of racism. I would distinguish racism in the ideational sense, a complex of ideas, beliefs, values, and racism in the socio-institutional sense, institutions, practices, social systems. For the first sense, I would favor this definition. Racism is the belief that 1, humanity can be divided into discrete races, and 2, these races are hierarchically arranged with some races superior to others. The second sense would then refer to institutions, practices, and social systems that illicitly privilege some races at the expense of others, where racial membership directly or indirectly explains this privileging. One second. Systemic racism affects racial minorities in the U.S., especially Black Americans, through discrimination, stereotyping, and apathy toward the continued economic inequality stemming from America's history of enslavement and legal segregation. Members of these oppressed groups experience these phenomena directly in a way that white Americans never would, and they see that America's pervasive individualism often does them a disservice by ignoring the obstacles they face as a result of their racial categorization. In other words, minority standpoints offer a first-hand perspective on systemic racism that the white standpoint simply doesn't. It is possible, desirable, and good to work to recognize the limits of our standpoints and to broaden our vision. God is love, and all human beings are capable of giving of themselves to one another, and so coming to a fuller understanding of what it is to be human. Thus, in the words of Gaudium et Spes, section 38, quote, "The effort to establish a universal brotherhood is not a hopeless one," end quote. Cultural differences can pose formidable challenges to this effort. Language barriers impede communication, varying rules of etiquette can cause offense, and different moral concepts and vocabularies can make even the best of intentions seem evil at first glance. However, the teaching authority of the Church commands us to overcome these obstacles and reminds us that it is never impossible. We have a duty to remember that even if each culture is rendered in a different artistic style by our endlessly creative Creator, we are all made in the image and likeness of God. Gaudium et Spes also states in section 25, quote, "To be sure, the disturbances which so frequently occur in the social order result in part from the natural tensions of economic, political, and social forms. But at a deeper level, they flow from man's pride and selfishness, which contaminate even the social sphere," end quote. Due to the effects of systemic racism, our national cultural landscape does not equally represent human communities. Ideas and interests representing white communities dominate. Thus, for a Catholic, approaching our post-truth world in justice requires embracing Catholic social teaching's preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. The preferential option for the poor and vulnerable begins with the premise that not everyone has equal access to our social systems, and therefore the poor and vulnerable are to be given particular consideration. The 1986 USCCB document, Economic Justice for All, Section 88, explains, quote, "The prime purpose of this special commitment to the poor is to enable them to become active participants in the life of society. It is to enable all persons to share in and contribute to the common good," end quote. Our primary concern as followers of Christ belongs to those whose basic needs and rights are in jeopardy. The current controversy over systemic racism highlights a reality that American society has long known but not adequately dealt with. African Americans and people of non-European descent do not have equal access to America's social systems, to cultural respect, and to safety in the streets. The preferential option for the poor and vulnerable requires that these voices receive priority. Merely giving them representation in existing institutions is not enough. The powerful and privileged have an obligation to work to hear marginalized voices as they have expressed themselves already. This isn't because European culture is necessarily an enemy of justice or because white lives or voices matter less. It's because of the simple fact that marginalized voices have been crying out for centuries and haven't been heard. Their marginalization reflects failure by the majority to see members of disadvantaged groups as Christ present in their midst. Our hope is that this perspective will help Catholics to heal divisions and spread understanding wherever it's lacking, especially regarding systemic racism. Since the horrific murder of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer last year, many Catholics have dismissed the movement for racial justice, claiming that Black Americans are using quote-unquote systemic racism as a scapegoat for their own problems or a vehicle for a wider progressive agenda. Others within the Church have, in response, framed systemic racism in America as an intractable societal malady dating back to the Founding Fathers that can only be overcome through direct cultural conflict. What we have to remember is that Christ calls us to exhort our brothers and sisters within the Church to strive to understand one another and work for peace in solidarity. Systemic racism is so insidious because all too often the only people who realize it exists are those who suffer from it. Those who are lucky enough not to have to be honest, humble, and open to the limits of their own understanding before they can assist in solving the problem. It's our hope that the concepts I've introduced in this talk today will facilitate that conversation and that growth in understanding. In the struggle to end systemic racism, just as in every other struggle against sin, the Church must strive to convert herself. True conversion demands that we emulate Christ by bearing his good news of peace and justice to the world. In other, better words, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Thank you.
Good morning, and what a joy it is for me to share with you today. I will try to go at the speed of light in this presentation to give some context to people that may not know so much about one of the ideologies that I will be talking today. So then I will premise my thesis of why these ideologies affect especially Hispanic Latinos. Almost 60%, statistical realities, almost 60% of Hispanics self-identify as Catholic. This is a national survey of Latinos by Pew Research. There are approximately 30.4 million Hispanics in the United States who self-identify as Catholic. 16.4 million are native-born, and the majority of those, 90% of those born in the United States, are 30 years or less, and especially 18 years or less. 14 million are foreign-born. Approximately 40% of Catholics in the United States are of Hispanic origin, and Hispanics are expected to become the majority group in the United States within a decade or two. 63% of those who identify as Catholics in the United States right now are individuals of Hispanic Latino descent of 18 years or less. So the future of the church in the United States, shall we say, has a Hispanic face. And the Hispanic presence is thus crucial to the future of the American church and to the ever-growing voting bloc in the United States. I'm going to start talking now about the ideologies that are affecting my cultural family. The main one being gender ideology, which is defined as a false set or system of beliefs about the human person, premised on the falsehood that the human identity becomes the choice of the individual. So my feelings about my self-perception are overcoming the reality of my sex body. According to this ideology, the person self-identifies as a gender identity based on their feelings and their sense of self as being male, female, neither, both, or something else. The something else is well over 100 different categories of supposed genders that exist today. Gender ideology asserts that an individual has the right to transition to a desired identity using social, medical, surgical interventions to feminize or masculinize the body's appearance. What does the church say about this? This is what Pope Francis says about this. He's misquoted so much. He says, "It is one thing to be understanding of human weakness, and another one to accept ideologies that attempt to sunder inseparable aspects of reality. We are called to care for people that have gender confusion, the ones that have true gender confusion or gender dysphoria, which would be about 0.3 of 1%, versus the rest, which I would propose it is a social contagion." The Pope also calls gender theory a global war against the family, and he called it wicked. Christian anthropology then clashes with the allegations and the proposals of gender ideology because the Lord created us men and female as a unity of body and soul made for eternal life. And everyone, says the Catechism in 23, 33, and 34, that everyone should accept and must accept his or her sexual identity because that identity equals their own dignity. Sex is only male and female. There's not a third sex, and we'll be talking about that. So who we are is important in our sex bodies because even for science, our brain patterns are different. My husband, Ricardo Luzondo, is a pediatric neurologist and can look at an image of the brain, and one of our audience members here, our great friend, has seen his presentation. He can say in 1 second whether that brain is a male or is a female, and that has a lot of importance. There's 6,500 genes that are different in males and females. And because of that, there is sex-specific medicine. You can misdiagnose or mistreat someone because of their gender identity. Every cell of the body has a sex, and you can actually reconstruct your body with cosmetic surgery to masculinize it or feminize it, but you will never change the DNA, the chromosome, the sex chromosome in your sex body. You can die, and they can mummify you, and in 3,000 years, they'll check the DNA, and they'll know whether you're male or female. This is what is being taught. My concern is this is what is being taught to children in our school systems since kindergarten. And now there is legislation to try to start it in pre-K. It divides the person as a self-defined person with different areas, different gender identity, different gender expression. Gender identity is that expression of who I perceive myself to be, man, woman, something else, both, or neither. My gender expression is how I look. My sex assigned as birth is supposed to be like a marker that the doctor that delivered me looked at me and guessed that I am male or female. He couldn't obviously see what I was, and that was now becomes a market. Another division of the human persons is sexually attracted, who they're sexually attracted to or who they're romantically attracted to. And this is being told to our kids since kindergarten, and there is a plethora of information and proof. A lot of people say that these things don't exist in schools. If you dig in, they are. Yeah, they can try to avoid it, but they can. Public schools promote this through supposedly anti-bullying affirmation groups, ideological groups like gender ally groups and inclusion and diversity. And this is exactly what they're being taught. And I don't want to show you some of the slides that we have of the actual pornographic content that is being taught to our pure, innocent children in their early years of development, because we would consider it pornographic. Then it's become cool. It's cool. You know, if I feel different about myself, and if probably I'm not a popular person, and as I identify as trans and gender norm-conforming, and kaboom, there is this massive amount of support, of inclusion, of help, of you are cool, you're the greatest. And we have in social media is plagued with activists like this gentleman that identifies as a woman. He has 350 million followers in social media. This is not inclusion, but confusion and delusion. So excessive time online and social media through gaming, anime. There's a lot of kids that have body issues, during puberty, unresolved loss in their life, poor peer relationships, sex abuse in their past, children especially on the autistic spectrum, that they're awkward about being themselves. They enter into this reality and they say, it must be my awkwardness and my almost hatred of my own skin must be because I am trans, and that's what they're being told. So a great percentage of the social contagion of our children and young people are people in the autistic spectrum. People with mental illness, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder think that they're gonna resolve their problems through this gender transition. This presents a clash of anthropology, the secular view and our Catholic Christian view, because in our Catholic view, we are created by God. And in this view, we are self-created. And I don't want to go through I'm self-defining, I'm not a creature, therefore there must not be God. And all of these ideologies, in the end, are atheistic, nihilistic, postmodern theories. It is definitely then a social contagion. Up to the past decade, the norm in the population for trans-identified people are 0.3%. Today, Pew Research did a research, and 10% of millennials and Gen Zs identified as trans or gender nonconforming. Barnum's results are even more staggering, 30% or less. I call this name ideologies that are a plague, because they are. COVID's incidence compared to this 30% is almost nothing. So in my case, and COVID can pass one day, and there's vaccinations. There's no vaccination against this social contagion that can have an impact in society that it is nameless. So the problem is that the impact of this agenda-driven culture, particularly gender ideology, finds fertile ground among Hispanics. And I will say my most extensive experience is pastoral. I found the problem then and went to study it. I started seeing, and by the thousands, my husband and I do about 47 events a year. We have been in person before more than 3 million people, and through television and radio, through more than 250. You could imagine the amount of mail that we get and the amount of people that we meet. So in these theories have the proposal that says that all of these studies, quantifiable studies, have no value. Lived experience has value over fact and over actual values. So what I'm proposing today, I'm assuming that maxim, so I guess my lived experience, it is very solid indeed, and validates more than if I had done a longitudinal study. Why Hispanics? Because of the sociological realities of machismo and marianismo, which are sociological characteristics of male and female gender role socialization in Hispanic cultures that had plagued our cultures and which have invaded their relationships for generations, and that can be rather toxic. Machismo is the belief and expectations that regarding the male role in society. It is a set of values, attitudes, and belief about masculinity or what it is to be a man, and it encompasses bad and good things. Some are bravery, honor, but the bad ones are dominance, aggression, sexism, sexual prowess, and unreserved emotions, among others. And they indeed, somebody that is a machista, indeed imposes in a very severe way against women, and that is actual toxic masculinity. Nothing else is. Everything else is just masculinity, which we badly need in our country. Machismo also includes attitudinal beliefs that consider it appropriate for women to remain in traditional roles and thus encourage male dominance of women. Marianismo, on the other side, is a set of values and expectations concerning gender roles that come from our Blessed Mother, from the virtues of chastity, of purity, of giving, and sacrificing for the family, but taken to an extreme. So one thing, to the extreme of being domineered in an abusive way. So Marianista orientation depicts women as nurturing roles and prescribes respect for patriarchal values. Marianismo historically comes to Latin American countries through the Spanish colonization, and it has become a reality of the culture. And these are some of the characteristics of women in Marianismo, which many times end up having us receive the skinny end of the stick. Machismo and Marianismo, there's been a pushback against it. And there's a lot of some writings about machismo and Marianismo, and it was coined by, the term Marianismo was coined by a 1973 article by Evelyn Stevens called Marianismo, the Other Side of Machismo, Machismo Present in Latin America. I suggest that you read it. So my pastoral observations is that machismo and Marianismo have affected our society. But these ideologies tell you that if you self-identify as another sex, you are indeed that other sex just because you think so. So you see where the Hispanic woman is thinking already? I am a man who is the powerful, who is the domineering, who is the one that makes the decisions, who controls, who has sexual liberty. Then what do I have to do in order to be like a man? The man that rape in Latin America is insidious. 45% of women, at least, are sexually either molested or raped. Up to 80% crossing the border. That's why I love my cultural family, but I don't like undocumented immigration for that reason. 80% of women and children crossing the border are sexually abused or raped. It is a problem. So to avoid that, what do you do as a Latina woman? As a Latina woman, you identify as a man. Then I'm going to be the person that has that power. No longer am I going to be raped or used or vilified or used as a sexual object. I'm gonna have the power just because I identify. So I said, what is happening to our girls? And that problem brought me to the academic study. On males, today, what is the culture saying? Masculinity, period, is toxic. Could you imagine machismo, which is actual toxic masculinity? So the young Hispanic men are saying, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be like my father. Not all Hispanic men are like that. I take it from my husband and so many other wonderful men and men that have known God. But the core of the people, the less educated, the more impoverished, this is very, very prevalent. So what is the boy gonna say? I don't wanna be like him. I don't wanna be identified as being like that. So what am I gonna do? That's why there's this tendency of feminizing men to avoid the supposed toxic masculinity. So the more distance they dissociate from it and identify as trans or gender conforming people. Machismo and Marianismo then make the Hispanics extremely vulnerable to it. I observed it. I knew that when I started researching, this is very little researched, very little. But what is there proves the point. I knew that I was going to find a greater tendency among Hispanics because I was seeing it pastorally. And machismo, gender ideology, critical race theory, and feminism all contribute to this view, and I'll touch on that very briefly if I have time. They're all postmodern, nihilist, neo-Marxist, atheist theories, which in conclusion we call ideological colonization, which is what Pope Francis calls it. That's where I got the term. Statistical evidence that I found. As you can see, you have the column of the general public within the different race or ethnicities. And as you can see, the incidence of trans-identified adults in Hispanics is the greatest of all the different groups. We can see it here in graphic form. For whites, it's actually within the trans-identified community, it's about 11% less than the greater population, and in Hispanics it's 6% more than the general population. And here we have it in percentages, 80.84%. Archbishop Jose Gomez was badly attacked this year for saying something that was, in my view, tremendously true, and he said this in a colloquium he had in Madrid. Today's critical theories and ideologies are profoundly atheistic. They deny the soul, the spiritual, the transcendent dimension of human nature. Or they think that it is irrelevant to human happiness. They reduce what it means to be human to the essentially physical qualities, the color of our skin, our sex, our notions of gender, our ethnic background, or our position in society. In denying God, these new movements have lost the truth about the human person. This explains their extremism and their harsh, uncompromising, and unforgiving approach to politics. And one of my greatest concerns is that Hispanic are very family-oriented, very life-oriented, and we're cutting them from this lifeline. Other ideologies plaguing our critical race theory, which divide us by oppressed and oppressor because of the color of their skin. In fact, I recently was called by African-American people that I am not Hispanic. I lost my identity because I am indeed too pale, and therefore I am white, like I'm all of a sudden European. And they could not invite me to the same organizations that I formed and funded so that we could have intercultural exchange because, you know, in the African-American groups, my presence in those groups would make the place an, quote, unsafe space. That is, when you take this sociology that my brother presents so well to the actual cultural practice, is becoming tyranny, and it's tearing apart communities. And the division among minorities, Hispanics and African Americans right now is brutal because of it. Not only black and white, we need to be extremely careful. Some things sound really pretty in theory, like Marxism, but in practice, they are a disaster. Same radical feminism is affecting, and we're exporting this to all of Latin America. We're seeing now churches being burned, where Hispanic women used to go to churches to pray. Now they go without brassieres, you know, exposed and burning churches because they cannot be free if they don't have the right to kill their own offspring. Ideological colonization is indeed a play. Gender ideology attacks the dignity of the human person in God's plan, destroys the body, which is the temple of the Holy Spirit. It creates infertility, and it objects and attacks marriage and family and God's plan, which many of these entities that so many people defend are formed with the basics of destroying the nuclear family organization. So they are attacking the family because when you attack your family, you create activists that are blinded and in the service not of the church or of the Lord, but of the state. And that is tragic. That is not liberating, that is oppressive. Because once we end up in systems of totalitarianism, everybody's gonna be equal. equal in indignity, in poverty, in misery, and in repression, and in lack of liberties. And I married a Venezuelan, and I lived in Venezuela 3 years during the Chavista effort, which sold the same kinds of lies. And let me tell you, it is not pretty. They're illiberal and anti-democratic, but there is hope. The innate strength of the Hispanic culture, we have a deeper and more intense sense of extended family. We're a stronger sense of community, longing for God and longing for belonging. And we're very open to life. Even you can see it in Latino immigrant, families, many undocumented with 5 or 6 kids, praise be the Lord. And they will not cause climate change either, because that is not a fact. And if it were a fact, then nobody has children anymore because of gender ideology and all of these ideologies, then who are we saving the planet for? Hispanic strength continued. We have a great spirituality lived by popular religiosity. We connect and engage with people of faith, keep faith in people, and we focus on the day-to-day of life. We have radical hospitality. We are open to truth. So what is urgently needed? Pastoral attention and evangelization in their language and culture, which is what my husband left pediatric neurology and I left my very successful practice of law, gave away our possessions and started with nothing, serving the poorest of the poor. And I've had white people tell me that the statistics, white privileged people tell me that the statistics and realities that I'm talking about based on their own ideologies cannot be true. I tell them, I've been there. The day you are there, you can tell me about it. We need formation and information on ideological colonization. We need outreach and information on Catholic doctrine and morality. What is true and beautiful? That's what my husband and I have done for 21 years. We don't have to attack anybody. We just tell them the beauty and truth of God's plan for man and woman, and how they both have dignity. And I've seen the most macho of men transform and kneel before their wives asking for forgiveness because they have been, as one gentleman said one day, with my wife, I had been a beast. And 2 years later, I went back to that community. They were the leaders of the marriage and family ministry at that parish. The truth is powerful. We don't need fancy ideologies to change the world. We have to let them know also how legislation is being trying to be passed, like the Equality Act that is everything but equal, how proposed legislation can directly affect them, how they're losing their children. It is a system of loss. When your boy comes saying, I'm not Jose, I'm so Josefa, and you're blindsided because you don't know the language and you can't even find out what is being told to them in school, or you don't even know how to use social media to know what it's being fed from it, the garbage that is being fed of the manure, I shall say. We also need effective, culturally appropriate, and sensitive messaging to Hispanics, such as the project that I proudly collaborate with, which is the Person and Identity Project, which has a Hispanic outreach initiative, that would be me. I do everything in Spanish, reproduce all the videos, and we're saving massively many youth and many parents. Another potential initiative is Edify, who is looking. It's a project of Catholic Vote. Check it out at edify.us. It's led by Scott Landry. They're making an extraordinary effort to bring information in an accessible way to open the eyes of people, because most people, what they hear in their propaganda, Hispanic media is 100% progressive propaganda, 100%. They have no other source if they're going to do it in Spanish. So all they hear, they're being good to immigrants, which check out the border to see the absolute tragedy. And I did 23 years of immigration law. Now it's when we have a debacle with what's happening in the southern border, and now nobody's paying attention. That's a tragedy. And that's what Edify is trying to do. But if you feel compelled, or anybody listening feels compelled to help these two initiatives, go ahead and do so. Because we're talking about essentially 50% of Catholics. If we don't reach Hispanics, we're not reaching half of the church. And in the future, this demographic is going to continue growing. So I hope that these slides are used only with permission and they're for private use. If you wish, please do not disseminate them any other way. And if you want to sign up for our newsletter at the Person and Identity Project of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., as a project of the Catholic Women's Forum, led by the wonderful Mary Rice Hassan, who I have the privilege to work under, and they're a legacy family, very well-known family here at Notre Dame. You can check it out, share it with others, tell Hispanic people, tell people of any language, and I hope that you dig into these issues in a deeper way and contribute to an effort to save our society and our faith, because all of these ideologies are atheistic and want to erase faith under the guise of social justice.
Good morning. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And I want to compliment my co-panelists for their super fascinating discussions or presentations. And I appreciate that how clearly it's motivated by care for the person. When I wrote my book, Awake Not Woke, some of my more progressive friends kind of side-eyed me, "You're writing what?" But it truly was motivated by true care for persons. Various metrics confirm that over the last 30 years, there's been a sharp increase in loneliness. Almost 1 in 4 Americans feel isolated, many with no person in whom to confide, according to a 2018 study from the Kaiser Family Foundation. Increasingly, this is seen as a societal epidemic contributing to depression and other health risks, mental and physical. Undoubtedly, the last couple of years have only increased this trend. While superficially we're more connected than ever through technology and social media platforms, such connectivity often serves to reinforce our isolation, making us more global but less neighborly. There are also various modern conveniences that mean that we need each other less in practical ways, and that this obscures the very human and far more important ways in which we need one another. Despite causes for this all being surely multivariate, there seems to be something deeper happening. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, German philosopher Hannah Arendt, quote, wrote, "What we call isolation in the political sphere is called loneliness in the sphere of social intercourse. While isolation concerns only the political realm of life, loneliness concerns life as a whole. Totalitarian government, like all tyrannies, certainly cannot exist without destroying the public realm of life, but totalitarian domination as a form of government is not content with this isolation and destroys private life as well." Far from a mere political phenomenon, the woke movement seeks not just disruption of our social order, but of our personal and spiritual order, disruption of the interior life and the ability to share that interior life. The ideology wins many adherents by operating parasitically off Christian precepts and instincts and seeking to replace them. Pointing to real problems and true injustices prompts us naturally to the sort of compassion that the Christian life truly demands. It appeals to our better natures and then supplies fundamentally destabilizing and dehumanizing answers. My purpose here is to clarify the internal logic of this movement so we can understand it, why it is both mistaken and destructive, and briefly how to respond to it. A challenge in tracing any movement is identifying a starting point, but any historical genealogy of the woke must look to the convergence of the philosophies of Hegel and Marx concerning historical development and progress that would become the bedrocks of what was the Frankfurt School and eventually the modern progressive movement. Central to Hegel's philosophy was that the world is one being that develops like an organism and progresses through time. It is a mind that interacts and expresses itself in nature, particularly through the organization of the state. This interaction bears contradictions and imperfections which beg to be exposed and resolved in a rolling process to societal progress. Eventually, through this system of cycling and synthesizing, we achieve a perfected state. This process Hegel called the dialectic, and it laid a groundwork for a metaphysical understanding of idea and nature as a process. History moves by way of this engine. First is idea, thesis, expressing itself in nature, antithesis. This interaction with the contradictions propel the progression to a resolution, the synthesis. And the resolution becomes the new thesis, expressing itself in a new antithesis with new contradictions to be exposed and resolved, progressing and onward toward the absolute state of perfection. In this framework, we see the modern progressive movement, which judges the present with the imagined eye of the future and never with the wisdom of the past, from which we can learn little but can condemn much. The modern obsession with being on the right side of uppercase history is not born out of reverence for the past, but out of hatred of it. Hegel thought in triads, and it is through this the framework of the Trinity that we can understand how the dialectic comes to replace the faith. The dialectic can be understood as a human systematizing of the Trinity, with the Father as a thesis, the Son, the manifestation of the idea in the world, the antithesis, and the Holy Spirit, the synthesis flowing from the union of the thesis and synthesis. Heaven, then, is not in another world, but rather in the perfection of this one, through the final realization of a societal utopia in which contradictions are all overcome. It was in this framework of dialectic that Marx found the groundwork for communism. But what Hegel understood to be a progression of mind or spirit, Marx as a materialist applied to the economic system, and understanding that economics is the primary motivator for all human action. He seized on the dialectic framework as the means to stoke endless critique and crisis, exposing the contradictions in the system and inciting revolution until society was perfected. He knew that there were two main obstacles hindering his communist utopian revolution: religion and the family. He believed the underclass is drawn to religion because it eases their pain in this life and gives them hope for the next. It encourages the proletariat to accept their circumstances rather than rebel against them. For a Christian, adversity and suffering can be ennobling and sanctifying. Imbued with such meaning, rather than an obstacle to his happiness, a Christian is prompted to find real purpose and dignity in suffering well his circumstances. But a revolution only germinates in a populace that is resentful and angry. The second obstacle is the family. In his letters, Marx wrote of his understanding that as the Roman Empire was brought to its knees by sexual licentiousness, so could ruination be brought to the West through the breakdown of all sexual restraint. The revolution relied on the abolition of the family. The Institution for Social Research, formed after the First World War, trying to discern why the revolution, which Marx had said was inevitable, had not failed to take hold. And they came to be known as the Frankfurt School, coming to America in 1935. And according to the Frankfurt School, Western culture promotes, it is deeply resistant to revolution due to an internalized authoritarianism by way of the patriarchal family. The question of why the revolution had not come to pass was answered. It needed to be broadened beyond revolting against class to revolting against patriarchy, revolting against racial oppression, and the oppression of traditional sexual normativity. In addition, the postmodern movement effectively stripped meaning and shared narratives from our psyche, language, and sensibilities in ways that accelerated the destabilization and rupture. All right, so the long simmering crisis that grips our culture now, currently in the form of the woke movement, has exploded in recent years, leaving our society divided and intransigent. We have destabilized the natural bonds that root and fortify us, and in their absence, we are pulled by the sway of the crowd. And the danger of a crowd is being populated by individuals so unmoored from ancestors, from meaning, from connection, is that it can quickly turn into a mob, in which persons are further reduced, absorbed, and made anonymous. This is the inevitable result of the severing of the human person from a common language and meaning, from a shared past and eternal destination, from his fellow man, and even from himself. So to understand the operating principles of woke ideology, I distill it down to three fundamental distortions. First, it reduces the person in favor of the group. Secondly, it corrupts our understanding of a stable human nature by deifying our will. And thirdly, it elevates human power over true authority. In these three distortions, group over person, will over reason, power over authority, what is rejected, reason, the person, and authority, are the characteristics of the Logos, which is the reason or mind of God manifest in the person of Jesus Christ, who is the author and authority of all. These three ruling dogmas form a sort of unholy trinity of the movement. In the first, in true community, the good of the person is incorporated into the good of the group. In an unhealthy framework, the good of the person is subjugated to and ultimately threatened by the power of the group. The human family is our first introduction to belonging, and here we can see how in a well-ordered family, the group and the person are in balance. This familial harmony is, for most, immediate and intuitive. The baby longs for her mother, bonds with her father. Father and mother are given an intense drive to nurture, care for, love, protect, provide. A parent is invested in the good of the child to the point where the child's good becomes the parent's good. And it's not accidental that one of the first acts of family life is the task of naming a new member. One of the lingering visual horrors of the Holocaust are the numbers tattooed on the arms of the survivors. And in dystopian stories such as Stranger Things, a character is named with a number to indicate that she is valued as no more than one in a series. The act of naming is an indication of the belonging and identity formation that is natural to family life. It is a whisper of intimacy, irreplaceability. The child is not just anyone, she is particular. Hearing one's name hints to her that a person is known, not for the sake of an instrumental value, but in and of herself. In other words, the revolutionaries, of course, were right. In losing the family, we tend to lose our very selves and are left to desperately grasp at any identity on offer to us, contrived or otherwise. For the woke, tribalism replaces family, as persons are reduced to instantiations of a larger group identity. One effect of this redefinition is that we begin to find our moral stature in our victimhood. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt comments, the key idea is that the new moral culture of victimhood fosters moral dependence and an atrophying of the ability to handle small interpersonal matters on one's own. At the same time that it weakens individuals, it creates a society of constant and intense moral conflict as people compete for status as victims or defenders of victims. Raising the moral status of victimhood increases the incentive to publicize grievances and makes the aggrieved more prone to highlight their victim identity and less capable of triumphing over them. It is an outlook of despair and ultimately rage, reducing and absorbing the person into the force of a group. To understand this better, let's think about how a person is defined according to Christianity versus according to the woke. Other than in the context of family, questions about what it means to be human are traditionally understood in the West to look to universals with a shared reliance, with a reliance on a shared humanity. What is distinctively human is what we share in common and what separates us from the beast, rational animal. In contrast, the woke seek to answer such fundamental questions in a way that renders a shared humanity and commonality impossible, centering and redefining all people into opposition, each defined fundamentally as a representative of an oppressive or oppressed group or some combination. Relationships, therefore, serve as a source of power struggle rather than a wellspring of connection. In addition to being distinctively human by our capacity to reason, special revelation adds that we are children invited into familial relationship with God himself. In contrast, for the woke, we are not to define ourselves by the love of God, but rather by the hatred of society. Instead of a gospel message of a mission to go out and spread the good news to people that they are loved, the woke definition creates a sort of anti-gospel mission to go out and spread the bad news to people that they are hated. This is the revolutionary activity called raising their consciousness. Whereas membership in the family is personal, membership in the political tribe is abstract. We see this clearly in the way that sharing in group membership is necessary but not sufficient. What is demanded is to share in the ideology as well. For the woke is the ideology, not the individual, which must flourish. For example, if oppression is at the core of womanhood, then woman's perfection exists in fighting her oppression and striving for power. A woman who is not a feminist in the right way is denying something central to her womanhood. And we saw this when a group of pro-life feminists tried to have an official association with the Women's March in 2017, and they were told they had to disassociate because they weren't advocating for women in the right way, particularly with respect to abortion. This is also echoed in a recent statement by the main author of the New York Times 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, when she says, quote, "There is a difference between being politically black and being racially black. We all know this, and we should stop pretending that we don't. In lacking the correct political consciousness, such a person is repressing the core of his or her identity. While diversity is the stated goal, uniformity and power are the actual goals." The second dogma is will over reason. In this second distortion, the neo-Marxism of the first distortion is married to the neo-Freudianism of the Frankfurt School. Our oppression comes to us not only externally, but also internally, by way of our tendency to strive to conform our desires to social norms that inhibit ourselves. This distortion is often referred to as therapeutic culture or expressive individualism. In this framework, our reason for existence is expression, to acknowledge, reveal, and live out our authentic selves based on our personal desires, especially our transgressive ones. The natural law conception that there is a moral order to the universe and an intelligible telos in our embodied nature must be rejected if our personal flourishing depends on the revelation and expression of a core identity that is identical with our personal predilections. The more transgressive the sexual desire, the greater potential a person has for liberation, as such desires require a greater defiance of social norms. The sexual revolution that flowed directly as a result of this woke dogma, although it wasn't called woke at that time, is not merely a revolution against social conventions. Rather, it's a revolution against the idea that there's a moral order underlying social order, and a revolution against a concept of an enduring human nature. This idea that human nature was a sort of putty that we could mold at will has been intrinsic from Marx to Mao to Pol Pot, and has gained easy traction with progressives in the West. It was notoriously enshrined by the Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy in '92. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Echoing this sentiment, Hillary Rodham Clinton wrote that her goal was to remold society by redefining what it means to be a human being in the 20th century. This second dogma is time and again is sold to us by appealing to compassion. From the sexual revolution to the transgender movement, we are told that the sexual lives and identities of others do not affect us, and that love demands that we normalize such behaviors and identities in both law and culture. But a movement that seeks to disassociate us from human nature and even bodily reality is not one that leads to acceptance of people on the fringe. Rather, it is an ideological bomb that enshrines in the idea that moral order, which flows from the very nature of God, is not a roadmap to flourishing, but is instead a force of oppression. Accepting such a revolutionary premise leads not to compassion and tolerance, but the violence and chaos of nihilism. If we can be anything in defiance of bodily reality, then our bodies are meaningless, which means that we are meaningless. So meaningless that we can be mutilated. In order for a person to be anything, she has to be nothing. The third fundamental woke error collapses our conception of authority into merely that of domination and power, rendering the good and true and right authority unrecognizable. This effort to collapse our concept of authority into power, when paired with a real and targeted collapse of morality and virtue in society, is an effective one. Where legitimate authority exists, we are now trained to perceive only domination. In fatherhood, we see this acutely. For many, it's difficult to understand the father as a natural icon of authority, when for decades, fatherhood has been undermined from without and within. But even with poor examples, personal examples of authority figures, most people sense what ought to have been. For example, despite the resistance to admit of fatherly authority, when pressed, most can say what it ought to have been, and by implication, what authority more generally ought to be. A good father imposes discipline, not for the sake of control over those in his charge, but for the sake of their freedom, knowing that boundaries come before self-mastery. A good father empowers his children to gain independence and take on responsibility. In contrast, a tyrannical father uses discipline in order to manipulate and control, keeping his children incompetent, afraid, and dependent. The revolutionaries from Marx to Marcuse wrote about the vital need to depose the father by undermining his authority through sexual licentiousness, and they were, on this, of course, correct. In cutting off the head, the whole is destabilized. Most of our social pathologies can be traced back to either poor fathers or absent ones. The popular diagnosis is that such pathologies require an even further rejection of masculinity. But such a diagnosis prescribes the cause of the disease as the cure. A society with rampant fatherlessness and abuse is in want of manliness, not in excess of it. St. Thomas defines effeminacy as an unwillingness to pursue what is arduous out of a disordered attachment to one's pleasures. The emasculated man is defined by an unwillingness to suffer, rendering him particularly inept at the masculine responsibility to provide and protect. In undermining fatherly authorities, the revolutionaries knew that they would also undermine authority generally, specifically that of God. God the Father is, as St. Thomas said, the primary analgate. He is not like a father metaphorically. He is the Father to whom all fathers point. Human fathers grow in fatherly perfection the more they grow in likeness to him, indicating that the truly manly man is the holy man. In the attack on authority, it is God who is reimagined as our ultimate oppressor. Authority must be connected to structures of hierarchy. All authority figures, with the exception of God, must be subject to authority themselves. Stripped of religion, our religious impulses are not eradicated, but relocated. Hegel replaced the second person of the Trinity with a concrete manifestation of the mind and the organization of the state, and it is to this entity that we are prompted now to defer our reason and bend our will. The mortal wounds the revolution seeks to inflict on the concept of fatherhood leaves a society of orphans. Like a child deprived of a father, a culture looks to fill that void. The unfathered, deprived of real authority in their lives, can be the first to yield to the control of an authoritarian. The modern Hegelian obsession with being on the right side of history, as we said earlier, is not born of reverence for the past, but hatred of it. And I think of the symbol of this as a man and is terrified of his son. There is that it's only the younger generation that's going to keep getting closer to perfection, and therefore their judgment on us is what ultimately matters. There's no internal limiting principle in a race to revolution. It creates a spiral, a race to progress. Restoration. Okay, I know my time's coming. The effort to resist this movement will need to be waged on various levels, from grassroots efforts at school board meetings to political and legal channels to redirecting capital to non-woke companies. Many of these efforts are already underway, but most essentially, the movement must be resisted in the manner in which it attacks. In the attack on the person, reason and authority must be met with a response that is deeply personal, unwaveringly grounded in truth, and deeply committed to restoring right masculinity and reverence of all for God. Two of the most prominent figures to endure the horrors of tyranny of the last century were John Paul II and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and their preeminent messages all spoke to the need to resolutely affirm each, the person, reason, authority. John Paul II famously formulated a canon of writing on the dignity of the person, particularly the embodied person. Solzhenitsyn exhorts listeners not to follow their will, but to will only what is true. Let the lie triumph, but not through me. The simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in the lie. And the summation he gave of all man's ills was simply that man has forgotten God. So our response must be personal, unwaveringly truthful, and deeply reverent. Modern man is anonymous, cut off from a robust and meaningful family history or common and unifying history as countrymen. From our future, we are unmoored as well, without a mission or purpose and disconnected from the hopeful and sobering concept of eternity. In this late modern anonymity, we are ruptured from our heritage, our telos, and ourselves, past, present, and future. In search of an identity, we tend to grasp onto a facsimile of one, but an impersonal, reductive identity will not satisfy us. So how do we come to reclaim the anonymous man? We begin by knowing him, knowing what a person is, that the human person is defined not by evil, ultimately, but by a loving God, defined not by embracing our ability to transgress moral law, but in having the freedom to choose to follow it, and defined not by disdaining history and fatherhood, but by reverencing it. In this personalist approach, we are prompted to become people who can think not with ideology, but with reality, without denigrating or deifying man, but seeing him with the clarity of being known. Being known in intimacy of family life and friendship, and the intimacy of the confessional is terrible and beautiful. Such intimacy forces us to see our faults, but it also prompts us to contend with them. There's a particularity and a vulnerability to love. The things we wish were not there cannot be wished away when someone else really knows us. We become people who think with reality in a way that is both humbling and hopeful. In her wisdom, the church sets paths, routines, and opportunities throughout our lives to live in a way in which we can be truly known so that we might know him, through Mass, daily examination of conscience, through frequent confession, through the call to be authentically neighborly, to see Christ in the other, and through lives of vocation. While ideology prompts us to scan for the faults of others, the faith prompts us to continually take responsibility through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. And the overflow of these things help us to see others with mercy, knowing how much we are in need of it. We are prompted to see others not as representatives of identity based on politics, oppression, or power, or accusation, or victimization. Instead, an identity is revealed that is both deeper and higher and far more ennobling. It is the irreplaceable identity of each human being as a true son or daughter of a divine Father. This ability to know and be known in true friendship begins to end the anonymity and isolation that plagues us. The heart of man cannot be satiated with what is on offer from an ideology. While it might seem like much of the world has gone mad, we should have the courage and confidence that comes from great clarity that the longings of the human heart can be masked but not eliminated. There are true ideologues, faithful to woke dogmas, but there is also a quiet but not small subset of people who are repeating a script with little heart as they are quietly pulled by design and desire to the possibility of deep meaning and the hope of some grand fulfillment of an unidentified longing. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all three of our panelists. We have a few minutes for questions. Please come forward to the microphone on your left, my right.
Thank you. I had a question for Isaac. I read the public discourse article you mentioned, and I had two takeaways from it. One was that there was evidence of racism in the criminal justice system. But two, another takeaway I had from that was that the author said he did not think that the term systemic racism was a helpful term.
Okay.
He said that it was too ambiguous in some ways, and I agree with that because, when you hit it, when you're asked, do you believe in systemic racism, it's a broad brush. It seems to entail many different systems, education, the criminal justice, and so you're forced to say, I believe in systemic racism, and there was a lot of compelled speech about that. It seemed to me, the quarterback for New Orleans, they kind of, a lot of people felt forced to affirm that I believe in systemic racism, but it's an ambiguous thing, and I don't know if it's a helpful term either. But what do you think? Do you think it's is there a way around that?
Thank you. Now that's a good question. That's a very important question. I think it's important. So I'm of two minds about that. I think on the one hand, I think it's important to use the terms that people recognize to participate in a public conversation in a way that people will find accessible. I think there's a temptation for academics like myself in particular to parse and be precise and honestly have a little bit too much fun with definitions and refining them. And, in discussing something as important and as salient as this, I think it's important to use an entry point that people recognize. On the other hand, as with any set of terms that's very much in use in the public sphere and something that has been so closely associated with political agendas and political identities, there is always a danger in associating yourself, whether by accident or by coercion, with ideologies and implications that you don't necessarily embrace. So, I think using the terms that people recognize in order to enter into the conversation is important and maybe inescapable. But once we're there, then once you've established a connection and once you've established yourself as having a place in the discourse, then it is important to present definitions that are more precise and that you're more willing to commit yourself to. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
This is also a question for Isaac, and thank you to the entire panel. When you gave your definition of racism, and then, as often happens with people who are, quote, anti-racist, within your discussion, you then painted everyone in one group as having this, like a victim, everyone who's white not being a victim or by definition being an oppressor. Is that not arguing against what you're saying in the first place, in that the group, you dismiss sort of the individualism in this country, but ultimately, if we go through all the various groups that each one of us is identified with, the ultimate group ends up being the individual. And if we put people in groups, like your talk was about race. Well, it could have been about gender, it could have been about systemic anti-womanism in the United States, or any number of different things. Are we not ultimately taking away the agency of the individual? Shelby Steele and Bob Woodson have written a lot about this, specifically with regards to blacks in America, and how they argue that it's not the legacy of racism, a legacy of slavery that led to the disparities, but it's the legacy of white guilt of the 1960s, where collectively people recognized what had been done wrong in the past and then tried to fix it, in essence taking away agency from an entire group of people. And that has, in their argument, led to what the problem is now. So by doing this, the ultimate question is, are we not taking away agency from individuals when we paint them in groups?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say that the two claims, one, that societally assigned identities are important and they shape our understanding of society, and two, that human persons are creative and morally responsible agents, are not in conflict. I think many people who put a lot of emphasis on group identities reduce people to group identities, but I don't think that that's essential to the assertion that group identities are important for how we understand society and our place in it. And I think, so the feminist standpoint theory that I cited deliberately contrasts itself with postmodernism. It deliberately contrasts itself with, it's a critique of postmodernism, and it pushes back against the idea that we are reducible just to group identities. So to understand ourselves as being the inheritors of concepts and self-understandings and categories that we did not choose and that are imposed on us, and that we grow up in maybe without realizing it. I think Collins and Harding, who I cited, would argue this too. Knowing the categories in which we're brought up and knowing the categories that people use to understand society and knowing that sometimes people are reduced to those categories doesn't necessarily reduce us to those categories. It makes us more able to recognize how those categories are being used and to push back against them, right? So, understanding people in terms of categories, like we should, the human person cannot be reduced to the categories to which we belong. But I would maintain that understanding, these categories, many of which are arbitrary, like race, is important to being able to be self-critical. Yeah, is important to being able to be self-critical about our own approach to society. So, if that's a decent answer.
I may add very quickly, at least in the Hispanic community or in the Hispanic and Black community, having been director of intercultural ministries, it does have a tremendously negative effect. It does create a culture of victimhood and also takes away agency, very much. But it also creates a culture of entitlement, which further takes away agency. So it's completely negative. The Hispanic culture is being transformed because of this. And from the hardworking, non-complaining, I'm going to put foot on the table, joyful people of faith, our emerging leadership in Hispanic ministry in the country are bitter, angry, social justice warriors, I call them social justice guerrillas, guerrilleros de justicia social, that are plaguing our people with these ideologies that are a cancer, in my opinion.
So friends, we are past time. We have time for one more short question.
Thank you all so much. Isaac's talk really sparked a lot of discussion, so mine is also for Isaac, but I would love to hear all the panelists' thoughts. I wish we had more time to go into all this, but I guess just rather simply, we hear a lot of discussion on systematic racism in this day and age, especially, amongst our peers, and it's kind of given and posited without much challenge and without much explanation. It's just accept this, and now let's work to change this thing that we don't understand. So I was just wondering if maybe you could give a definition of systematic racism. And I know we mentioned criminal justice earlier, but just your take on it, and maybe if the other panelists have thoughts on this as well, I would love to hear it. So thank you.
No, yeah, that's a fair question and an important one. So the definition of racism that I used in my talk, I think, really gets to the heart of it in a clear and simple and precise way. And that definition uses the term socio-institutional instead of systemic, but that's the idea that I was going for. So, I would go back to that. So I would distinguish racism in the ideational sense, a complex of ideas, beliefs, values, and racism in the socio-institutional sense, institutions, practices, social systems. For the first sense, I would favor this definition. Racism is the belief that 1, humanity can be divided into discrete races, and 2, these races are hierarchically arranged with some races superior to others. The second sense would then refer to institutions, practices, and social systems that illicitly privilege some races at the expense of others, where racial membership directly or indirectly explains this privileging. Right? So this definition, it defines race kind of explicitly or implicitly rather, as that racism is the belief that humanity can be divided into discrete races, and so it attacks that belief at the start, right? So I would argue that the idea of race, like the reason that people were ever divided into races was to justify slavery and colonialism, right? And so in order to tackle racism, you have to confront the fact that the category of race really shouldn't exist. But it does, and it means a lot to a lot of people, and a lot of people use it to understand reality. And so we have to sort of confront race on its own terms and say these people that you've categorized as African Americans are at a broad scale disadvantage when it comes to accessing institutions and social systems. So just the use of that category to stereotype people and to reduce people to that category and to justify unequal treatment in a way that's unfair would be my definition, drawing directly from Milton.
You said something very important. These ideas go very much unchallenged often because of cancel culture. Because if you voice it, there's censorship. If you voice it, you're judged. Your job is gone, your reputation is gone, your livelihood is gone, and it happens. I know it in a very personal way. I know that that is true. So these are tyrannical ideologies.
Friends, we are 10 minutes over session. I want to thank our panelists for their papers, the audience for your engagement. I'm sure our panelists will be willing to stay around if there are further questions, but it is our final remaining obligation to take our papers one more time.